I'd like to start my speech by thanking Disha, our president, for giving me the privilege of speaking in our final debate of term. I would also like to start my speech by taking her at her best, her roast of me, reminding you that yes, we are outnumbered in Wales 3-1 by sheep. So I urge you, when voting, to just think of us poor Welsh people. What are we going to do if we can't show the sheep who's boss anymore by eating them? We are in grave danger of being taken over by these animals. I am not an environmental scientist, nor am I a nutritionist or a doctor or a farmer, so I won't preach to you on these things when there are other people here who are so much better positioned to do so. But what I am is a student, a young person, living student loan to student loan in a household of meat eaters and some veggies, with friends and family back home who are farmers and who farm very sustainably, as David pointed out to you. I have a stressful daily life fueled by an Oxford degree and the terrifying prospect of having to do something with my life once I leave this place. So forgive me if I don't tend to spend too much time planning out and preparing my meals. I'm willing to bet that most people in this chamber can relate to one of, if not all of these things. So I'm going to talk about why I, and you, given the personal choice, just wouldn't become a vegan. And the fact that most people tend to agree means that attempting to solve the problem spoken about on proposition with veganism is a doomed endeavor anyway. And later on in my speech, I'll explain why on balance, I think ethically, it is still remains the right choice not to go vegan. First, let me explain why I think this personal take holds any value in a debate that is largely about fundamental ethics. While I think it's meaningful to debate the ethics of consumption, I also think it's nearly impossible to do so effectively. Not only because right and wrong are different to different people and always will be, but also because when it comes to consumption and human behavior, it is near impossible to reach a point of total morality. So people are just going to pick the side that is most convenient for them anyway. If we eat animals, we have to kill them. But if we don't, they die because we ruin their habitats for crops, or they can't survive in the wild, or the fact that we can't shear, milk, or eat them anymore renders them fairly useless in today's society in the condition that they're at, after thousands of years of natural selection, so they're phased out entirely anyway. Listen, I won't stand here and argue that conditioning people into thinking that KFC is a good protein source is healthy, but neither is pumping out artificial produce onto shelves as protein replacements and convincing people that taking 5 vitamin supplements a day will restore the balance that's been thrown off by adopting a diet very few human bodies have lived on since the conception of the race. So let's talk a bit about why I just wouldn't become a vegan within the context of my own life. Number one, I would be kicked out of my house. For some illustration, I was sat at a table of farmers at my godfather's wedding a couple of years ago, and me being the resident city slicker from Cardiff, I know, I was asked, "Oh God, you're not one of those vegetarians, are you?" My aunt, uncle, and cousins are veggie, but my grandma insists that my cousin's boyfriend cooks a turkey every year so she doesn't have to endure a Christmas nut roast. I think it's quite clear that if I came home this vacation and announced that I would no longer not just be eating meat, but no cow's milk, no honey, no eggs, no cheese, and so on, not only would I have to endure a lot of teasing and a traitor stamp on my forehead, but I'd also have to shop and cook for myself and opt out of a system where I don't spend the dregs of my student loan on quinoa. It just doesn't make sense for me. Secondly, it would make me miserable. No matter how many times people tell me that tofu can be really nice if you just put enough seasoning on it that it no longer really tastes like tofu, I just know for a fact that I would tear up every time I walked past my local butchers and smelled their pork babs. That's just a simple pleasure in my life that I'm not willing to give up. The same goes for my chips and gravy after Bridge Thursday, and I just don't think a mushroom kebab is going to hit the same. I refuse to believe as well that a large part of this chamber doesn't feel exactly the same way as I do. Socially, too, if I'm going out with my friends, I don't want to have to alter our plans based on my veganism, and they certainly don't want to. That's not a burden that I am willing to bear. You may think that these are sort of funny and insignificant little arguments, but they speak to a wider truth that switching to veganism just isn't realistic or desirable for most people, even if we take prop at their best and can see that this motion talks about a process and a journey as opposed to a cold turkey switch. I think if I told you, over a month or two, could you phase this stuff out, you would still say no. So seeking to alleviate climate or moral issues by encouraging the widespread adoption of plant-based diet is not only questionable in itself, as we've heard, but inefficient anyway. So we're best placed to think of other behavioral and systematic changes that don't compromise a fundamental human trait that has existed for millions of years. And finally, on nutrition. The 3-bean ragouts, mushroom beef Wellingtons, and buckwheat pancakes I see on my For You page look really good, but if you think that I'm cooking those in my 7-person windowless basement student kitchen, you are sorely mistaken. The reality is that adopting a diet with far fewer restrictions allows someone like me to get a variety of sources of nutrition and protein almost without thinking. And that is my priority, and I shouldn't be made to feel insufficient for not being able to go vegan. Now, briefly, on to the bigger moral questions. I'll cover 3 main things: the animals, the humans, and the environment. First of all, on animals. We've all heard the sort of ridiculous, and forgive me for being the third person, I think, to bring this up, Piers Morgan arguments of, oh, but what about the bugs? And it sounds ridiculous, but it's not necessarily wrong. And if we're holding the life of a cow to a certain standard, then surely mice, lizards, shrews, insects, bugs, and more should be held to the same point. Habitats are destroyed because of the rising demands for grains, not to mention the fact that these animals will simply cease to exist outside of a system of ownership. The animals that we consume are not built for nature, and I'm not sure what Proposition thinks will happen to them if we neglect them. I mean, I suppose either we domesticate them, I'm not sure if you want a cow actually in your house, but I also just think this is just as morally objectionable as milking them, or we leave them to die. No, thank you. Second, on humans. Quinoa, think about it. Once a staple food of countries like Bolivia and Peru, it has tripled in price since 2006. And whilst the richest in these countries gain from exporting it, the majority of people there just can't afford it anymore. Soya, too, it's now one of the leading causes of deforestation in South America. Veganism is far too reliant on certain very few crops, so we're inevitably creating an unsustainable and actively harmful production cycle. Yes, there are a couple of studies, no thank you, that suggest otherwise about these figures, but if there's, for every one that says this is wrong, there's about 5 saying it's right. And also this boom of economic exportation to countries like Peru and Bolivia, if we're saying that everyone gets slightly richer on balance, but actually the foodstuffs they're buying is becoming 3 times as expensive, we're not seeing an increase in living standards. Finally, British industry. Listen, I'm the last person to fall for the trap of, oh, British tradition and great British food and British crops. But it's not wrong. 88% of Welsh land is used as agricultural land. There are 650,000 people working in the agricultural sector in the UK. And we all know the historical meaning of the oldest profession, but really, it's farming. Humans have been living off meat, eggs, milk, and butter for thousands of years. Our bodies have developed in a way to accommodate that in the same way that our bodies have adapted to other constants in life. Our societies have also developed according to it, with thousands of families and communities built upon farming and communal sufficiency. Prop might argue that population numbers, rates of poverty, and industrialization mean that the resurgence of self-sufficiency and promotion of local produce is a dream that is too far gone to ever come back, but I disagree. We have all sorts of climate movements pushing for behavioral changes that people are adopting. If we can convince people to use metal straws, cycle to work, and romanticize Sunday morning farmers' markets, I'm fairly sure we can put some effort and funds into the promotion of British produce and into our farming industry. Also, we're just far more likely, on balance, to be able to convince the most stoic meat eaters in society to buy beef from the butcher instead of from Tesco than we are to convince them to replace that beef entirely with tofu. I will accept that it's not a realistic switch for everyone to make to switch to local produce, but if we can encourage a decent amount of people to alter their consumption habits, I still see this as a worthy change and a preferable change to going vegan. Finally, on environment, propositions say that we get all this land back, yes, and we'll use it to accommodate the 8 billion people who will now be needing more crops, which has pesticides, chemicals, artificial foods. Conventionally farmed soy, like corn and soybean fields, are a major source of greenhouse gases, air, and water pollution. And it's hard to feed an 8 billion strong population without having adverse effects on the planet that we inhabit. The same argument goes for the health. Yes, you may be less likely to get cancer if you eat a lot of greens. That doesn't mean you won't get it. Still, about 1 in 2 people in the UK get it every day. Most of those people could also, a lot of those people are also vegans and vegetarians, right? So it doesn't stand entirely on proposition. I'm not here to put vegans on blast. It would be really unwise of me to do so, seeing as Disha is sat directly behind me and I'm quite scared of her. I just ask that we consider the effects of encouraging a huge shift in human behavior that has existed for millions of years. It's not realistic, it's not fun, and it's not fixing the problem. Yes, there are some disturbing factors to meat consumption, but the same goes for any industry catering to billions of people globally. But for me, for most of you, and for most of the global population, veganism just isn't the answer. I urge you to vote opposition.